that. Today we have a very nice panelist, panelist list. Oh, here it is. Very lovely lineup of panelists that they are going to discuss about. We are going to discuss about that. Actually, just between us, we have been discussing this, exchanging a lot of emails about these topics, and we have plenty of topics that we would like to discuss here and share with you, and also hear of your feedback. So we want to discuss about how can we enhance the effectiveness of our current blind-to-blind peer review system. How can we mitigate the self-plagiarisms and plagiarism problems using automatic tools? We want to explore one very interesting idea of doing a hybridization of conferences and journals, following the model of the chess, and that has been very successful. Also, we want to explore why we see new records numbers for the top IACR conferences despite the successful start of the CIC IACR journal, and many other questions that we are going to hopefully be able to deliver today. So I don't want to waste more time. That's the introduction of the table, and we will start now with the introduction of each one of our panelists, starting with Kevin. So Kevin, please go ahead.
Testing. Somehow there's a button here that should work. You think that one? Years of college. My name is Kevin McCurley. I work behind the scenes as a volunteer for IACR, so I've touched a lot of things in the infrastructure. I've also, I'm wearing my badge from Crypto 85. I gave the first talk at Crypto 85, so I have a long history of screwing up things at this conference. When I heard about this panel, I sort of stepped back to think about the problem of peer review and where it started and where it's gone to. And also, my PhD is in analytic number theory, and I had come from a completely different publishing culture than computer science. And so it's interesting to look across different disciplines and see how peer review works or doesn't work. And if you go back, actually, peer review is not actually that old. There's this story of Einstein who actually submitted a paper, and he was horrified to find out that the editor had sent it out to a referee. This was not normal in his day, and he had never heard of this. And so he immediately withdrew his paper. Didn't like that. In 1974, there was this Nobel Prize winner, Max Perutz, who called in the editor of Nature to complain and saying, why are you sending papers out to referees? You really should just, referee yourselves among the editors. So this is even as late as 1974, a peer review wasn't really that normal. The way it really took off was in the 1970s. And there's actually an interesting history of peer review that was written by a physicist that you can look up online. And they sort of traced it back to the National Science Foundation and how they were trying to stop bad science. And actually, there was this Congressman, William Proxmire, who actually replaced Joseph McCarthy in his seat in Wisconsin. But he was criticizing the government for wasting taxpayer money on things and wanted to make sure that they only spent their money on legitimate science. And NSF sort of reacted to this and said, oh my God, we have to address this. And they started instituting peer review for proposals in those days. And right about that time, all the big science journals started doing this. So Nature and Science and The Lancet all started then instituting blind peer review. So it wasn't really until the 1970s. I know that sounds like a long time ago to many of you, but not to me so much. But and just as a side note, I want to talk about, when you talk about blind peer review, there are multiple kinds of blindness in peer review. So single blind is when the reviewer's identity is hidden from the authors, so the author wouldn't know exactly who reviewed it. In many journals, you'll send your paper in to an editor. Editor will send it out to an anonymous referee who will write a referee's report. You get it back, and you don't know who wrote your referee's report. Double blind is when the author's identity is hidden from the reviewer. That's something that's used commonly in computer science, but not universally. TCC, for example, doesn't use it. And then on the other side, in some parts of computer science, there's no blindness. So openreview.net, which is widely used in machine learning, the reviews actually get published quite often. And so you actually have a completely transparent process where reviews get published. One nice thing about that is that reviewers then actually get credit for, in some sense, a minor publication of their own, or a review of some paper. So let's wind this back for a second and think about what is the purpose of peer review. And I don't think we'd even have a universal agreement on that, on what the purpose of peer review is. It's some combination of the following things: to prevent the publication of flawed research. So maybe a wrong proof, or someone who publishes something that's already been known in the literature, or somebody misrepresents the history of it. It also provides an ability to give useful feedback to authors. So a reviewer sends back suggestions that it can actually improve the paper. And the other one that I think is a little bit more controversial is it somehow prioritizes which research you should read. So if you try to read all of ePrint, for example, there's like 2,500 papers a year. That's a lot to read. And a lot of people would like to have some filtering done to tell them what to read. What are the best papers to read? What should I spend my time on? And so we kind of look to selectivity of our publications to only publish the best research. Where best here, I'll put it in double quotes because it's a little unclear what that means, and it's highly subjective, but we appoint a committee to sort of provide that judgment and do some filtering on it. It used to be that a lot of motivation for this was that it would conserve resources. A journal was printed on paper. That's actually why they're called papers, in case you didn't know that. And they were then bound into volumes and sent out by the mail. It was quite an expensive operation to print and mail things. And so the resource was precious, and you needed to preserve it. You couldn't publish everything that was sent in. Nowadays, I think it's more the attention of readers because everything's published electronically. And so there isn't much cost to that. So there are some problems in peer review. I think you can find your own examples of problems. But one thing, as I've mentioned before, it isn't exactly clear what the purpose of peer review is. It means different things to different people in different circumstances. There's certainly ample evidence of bias. There has been studies that have shown this. There's gender bias in many fields. There's prestige bias toward institutions which have good reputations. There's confirmation bias, that people tend to like to review and accept things that they're in fields they're familiar with. So things that violate your model of the world may be uncomfortable for you to recommend accepting. Another problem is that refereeing slows down publication. Now, you could say that's a good thing because it causes people to think a bit longer if they slow down. The filtering on papers is somewhat random. When you get a committee who reviews the papers, they'll give some scores to these things, and there's a little bit of randomness built into that. And I've looked at the submissions to IACR conferences, for example. I forget how many we have, but I'm like the only person who has access to all the reviews and all the acceptances, all the decisions, because I don't actually submit papers to this venue. And there is an example of a paper that was submitted and rejected 7 times to different conferences. So if you've been reviewing the same paper, you should know why. There are also examples of things that were submitted 6 times, and finally on the 6th time they got accepted. Now, it could be that they got accepted because they just improved each time on the feedback from authors to get better and better. Or it could be that the coin was tossed and it just finally came up heads for them to get a reasonable recommendation. Hard to tell, but there has been evidence that as you increase the selectivity on a publication venue, the randomness can increase, right? That it's just a little bit unclear about exactly what causes your paper to get in or not get in. Another problem with peer review is it takes a lot of work. And in fact, I think we should actually, whenever you see somebody who's been on a program committee, you should thank that person. They're putting in a lot of effort to make science work. It's those people who actually make the whole process work. And I think that they deserve a lot of credit for that. I think that blind reviewing has this problem is it doesn't incentivize referees. A lot of disciplines have been complaining that they get under a traditional model where the journal gets a paper submitted and sends it out to a referee. A lot of referees just say, I'm not going to do it. There's no incentive for them to do it, right? They don't get any recognition for it. Now in computer science, we don't do that. We have a program committee that makes the decisions and does the reviews, and that's public. And so they get actually recognition for being on the committee. I think that's actually a great thing. I spoke to a colleague who works in machine learning. He was saying that in the machine learning community, there has been evidence of a lot of strategic collusion and dishonesty among committee members and reviews to make sure that their papers get accepted. And I've actually seen this myself in a programming committee I was on once where we had double blind refereeing and somebody was arguing very strongly for a paper and I couldn't figure out why. And it turns out it was that person's colleague that they were arguing for. They knew who the author was and I did not. And that when you experience something like this, very disconcerting. It happens. We, of course, would like to make sure it doesn't happen. And finally, I'll just mention the software that's available for reviewing. There are not that many options. The one open source option is HotCrap. That's what ICR uses for the venues. I've had to read some of the code for HotCrap. It's very difficult to understand and modify. And so I don't think we're in great shape on the kind of software we have available for that. Open Review, for example, is not open source. They have an open API, but they don't have open source. Yeah, they say they're going to be open source, but it's been 3 years. There's also a few ways in which computer science is weird. Computer scientists publish in conferences, almost no other field does, instead of journals. The peer review we have is not really blind. And so, as I mentioned, sometimes people know who it is. You can look it up. You know, the papers are often on ePrint, so you can just look up who the author is. But, you know, referees do get some recognition. That's a good thing. We have this scalability problem in our conferences also that, you know, I went to Crypto 85, and I think there were like 100 people there. And that, you know, it didn't have a scalability problem, right? You could schedule the talks over the 4 days, and there's plenty of time between talks. The talks could be 30 minutes long. And now, as we have 140 something papers at this conference, right? It's very difficult to fit them in. We have 3 parallel tracks. We have a lot of pressure on the schedule. And so it doesn't scale very well with the number of papers we have. The scarcity of speaking slots is sort of putting artificial pressure on the publishing to keep the number of acceptances down or expand the number of tracks. And so that's all I have to say. I'll hand it over.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You just to have continuity with this topic with Gaetan here. Gaetan, could you start, please? Introduce yourself, please.
Yes. So hello, I'm Gaëtan Laurent. I'm working in cryptography, in symmetric cryptography. And in the FSC community, we've moved to a journal conference hybrid model in 2016. And this was a really nice experience for us. And so since then, I've been thinking a bit about how we publish in cryptography and in the ICR. And I wrote a document a few years ago about trying to survey the current state and the current issues and a few ideas of what we could do. And the first thing, as a starting point, I think it's understanding the growth in the community, how it's going. I'm not sure you can see it very well, but so I made this graph with various metrics of growth, and you can see they all go up, but they go up as a relatively regular rate. Like the number of submitted papers, the number of published papers, the number of IACR members, the number of ePrint papers, they all go up roughly at the same rate, and it's doubling roughly every 15 years. So it doesn't mean it will keep that way, of course. And in fact, in the last years, it seems to be going a bit faster, but maybe that's just a fluke, or maybe it will grow faster in the future. I don't know. So if you look at this graph, you see there's one curve that's a little weird at the beginning. That's the number of ePrint papers, because at the beginning, ePrint was not very used, and then it became more used, and so the growth is very fast, but that's not a growth metric of the community. It's just usage of ePrint that was much faster. So it's not, you shouldn't look at it that way. So yeah, so there is growth, definitely. I have a few more slides. Yes, the number of accepted papers, yeah, of course, it's growing. So the first graph was logarithmic, so you could see that it's regular. Here, of course, you see that it's exponential, but it's a bit hard to read. And maybe this last graph is slightly more useful. The acceptance rates, you can see it varies a lot from one year to the next, and it's usually somewhere between 20 and 30%. And in fact, there was a time here between 2005 and 2010, where for the flagship conference, the acceptance rate was much lower, around 20%, sometimes lower. And that's at the time where we still had a single track at all the conferences, but the community had grown and it was becoming very hard to fit everything in a single track. And then we moved to double and triple track and the acceptance rate went up. So I'm not sure what's the right level of acceptance rate, but yeah, historically it's been moving and that's where it is now. So those are some data about the current state. And more generally, I think it's important to think about where we are, what are the problems, and then starting from the problems, what kind of solution we could look at. And in particular, there are some problems that are relatively easy to solve, but it's a matter of agreeing in the community whether it's a problem or not, and whether we want to solve it or not. For instance, some people would like to reduce travel, either for environmental reason or just because it's hard to get a visa, or they don't have money to travel, or they don't have time to travel. And so it's a question of whether we want to accommodate those people and make our conference more open to them. And for instance, one very simple option we could do is to just make presentation optional. Like if you have a paper at Crypto, currently, when you read the call for papers, it says if your paper is accepted, you will have to present it. And maybe we can just remove this. And I don't think it will harm the conferences. We actually did it for FSC since last year. And in fact, everybody came to the conference anyway. It didn't really make a difference, but I think it's something we should think about, and maybe that's a good thing to do. And it would be nice to have inputs from you on this type of idea. So this is like a small tweak we can make, and there are also some bigger questions, like more long-term thinking, what we want our conferences to look like. And one option, as I said in the beginning, FSC has been moving to a conference journal hybrid model. And I think this is really nice, and I think it would be nice to move more ISCR conferences to this model. So currently, FSC and CHESS are doing it. And the way it works is that we have 4 deadlines per year. You can submit your paper, you get an answer 2 or 3 months afterwards. And if your paper is accepted, you have to present at the next edition of the conference, because the conference is only 1 time per year. And the good thing is we are not stuck in the conference model where you have to make your decision before the conference, and you have to say yes or no to each paper. By moving to this journal model, we can say maybe to a paper. We can say, well, this paper is good, but there's this thing, it's badly written, you have to rewrite it, for instance. And we can say this, and then the paper will be resubmitted the next time and probably accepted. And this has really improved the interaction between reviewers and authors, and at least I think it's quite successful, and it would be nice to move other ISCR conferences to this model. So for the other workshop, area conferences, it's very easy. And for the 3 big conferences, Eurocrypt, Crypto, AsiaCrypt, it's a bit harder. But I think it's still possible. And in fact, in the ISCR community, we are in a relatively unique situation where we have those 3 big conferences that all have the same scope, that all have roughly the same level of selectivity. And most people, I think, just submit indifferentially to one of them, like the next one that's coming up when they have a paper. So it could make sense to like merge them or make them more interdependent somehow. But currently they run like 3 different conferences, each with a different PC. So it means when you submit to one, if your paper is rejected, you submit to the next one. It's a completely independent submission. And this, I think, wastes a lot of time for authors and for reviewers, because we have to restart the review from scratch. Sometimes it's a good thing if you had biased reviewers, but it also takes time for everybody going through this system. And so one proposal that I made in this document a few years ago was to try to merge them in a single journal with a single PC, and then you submit, and your paper will be accepted to one of the conferences. There are many different ways you could map the papers to the conferences, but maybe a simple one is just to let author choose at which conference they want to go. And this is also a way to reduce travel if they don't want to travel far away. And so I would be very interested in knowing your opinion on this. Would it be a good idea to have the conferences more integrated, or do we want to keep them separated? And so that's one possible idea for the future, to move toward something like this.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gaetan. I have a question before we continue with the introduction of our panelists, distinguished panelists. One question for the audience. Gaetan here proposed, after performing this analysis, he thinks that every 15 years, we are doubling our submissions, our submissions in the IACR conferences, doubling every 15 years. So my question for you guys is, should we call this the Laurent law or the IACR Moore's law? Which one do you think is more appealing? Okay, so can you please raise your hand if you prefer IACR Moore's law? Okay, Laurent law? Okay, so yes, this is recorded, so this is it. Thank you, Gaetan. And we will continue now with, I don't know if anyone would like to continue, perhaps Andreas, because he's the chief editor of this new journal of the IACR.
So I don't have a statement prepared. So I'm Andreas Hülsing. I am one of the editors-in-chief of the new Communications and Cryptography. And that journal was actually started up to exactly deal with this amount of papers. And essentially to deal with all the goals that Gatar actually mentioned, right? So if you don't want to travel, you don't have to travel, but you still have a venue to submit. The Journal of Cryptology doesn't handle this because it essentially, okay, I shouldn't say anything because I have a very bad opinion about this, but from own experience, you can easily wait 10 years to get a paper published in it. And just to give you another way to publish that takes a bit of the pressure. And while I think this started very well, and I think the idea of giving another venue works pretty well. So I know of several colleagues that submit just works where they say like, okay, this will not make it into the big conferences, so we send it to the CIC, or others that are just like, I cannot see conferences anymore, so I won't submit there. That part works, but I think it will in no way reduce the pressure on the big conferences and will not reduce the review effort there. And that is simply because if you look at how we're judging people in our community, like if you're hiring for whatever, if you're applying for funding, then people look at your CV, and this is us, right? I mean, the stuff goes to expert reviewers, and they will look at your CV. And if you don't have your X top tier conference publications, this goes immediately to trash. And as long as we continue doing this, people have a requirement, if they don't want to stop working in research, to actually publish in the top tier conference. And there's no chance by any other journal to push in to actually solve this. The only thing would be if we essentially then try to accept to go for the same bar of selectivity. But then again, you don't deal well with the amount of papers.
Thank you, Andreas. Well, many points can be raised here because, for instance, how would you compare this journal with the Journal of Cryptology? And publications in Journal of Cryptology generally are thought as top publications in our community. No, maybe we can discuss it.
I just had an interesting discussion with some of the editors. I mean, in my opinion, the Journal of Cryptology publishes mainly invited papers from the top conferences, like the full versions. And that's about it. I don't know who else. There's hardly anyone submitting otherwise, is my impression. Do we need this? In my opinion, we have ePrint. The papers have the stamp of being selected papers. Yeah, and then we come back to Kevin. So one argument I got from editors is that, look, in the conferences, you cannot check correctness. in the journal, you can. I started laughing because I don't think this is really, I mean, I will do my best, but this is in general, I think, not done. And this is also something I wouldn't claim for the CIC. Like, I mean, yes, we ask reviewers to verify correctness within the available time, but just by the load of reviews, this is essentially impossible. I mean, every one of us have their main job, right? And then you do this on top, and you cannot spend 3-4 days on a paper to really dive into the details of every proof. Just doesn't work.
Much. We will continue now with Alison or Nadia, whoever wants to. Alison, you want to start?
Yeah, I just want to say I've also been thinking, like Kevin, a lot about this question of the purpose of peer review, because as my day job now, I'm doing a startup in finance. We're kind of introducing the concept of publication and peer review to institutional stock trading, and they really don't like it, as it turns out. But it's been interesting to sort of thinking about, like, what is the purpose of that? Because we work in a field where we're basically the only people publishing anything about our research. And we have kind of the opposite of all the problems here, in the sense that we have absolutely everyone's attention because we're the only company publishing the space. So we get tons of readers. And the purpose of doing it is more just to bring some level of accountability and transparency to the process, and taking the lessons from that, sort of applying it back to cryptography. I think one of the most important things that Kevin brought up is that the limiting resource, I think, in our community as we grow and as we scale, is that, you know, even if we do a great job scaling our publication system, which is a hard process, so you can get more reviewers, you can reduce the time spent per paper, you can reduce the number of resubmissions. But at the end of the day, a single person trying to understand science is still a single person who can only read and absorb so many papers. So I think an extra purpose of peer review, that sort of selection, that sort of curation, that sort of indexing and organizing of knowledge, is something that we really haven't needed our peer review system to do as heavily for us as we maybe do now at scale. And in thinking about it, it seems to suggest that that the sort of data structures of that are also, I think, part of the problem, because when you try to read a paper and then it takes you to other papers and then it takes you to other papers, and there's probably better ways of organizing information for new people getting started in our field, or people trying to quickly get to the bottom of something, than having them always go through full papers. So though this is a little bit out of scope, I just want to throw it out there to put it in the back of people's minds. At the end of the day, we are computer scientists. We're supposed to be really good at organizing information systems. So something that I think is not incentivized or part of our peer review system currently, thinking about what are other better ways to make that information more consumable and more accessible, because I do think our limiting resource has shifted to attention, as Kevin mentioned, and I think we have a new set of scientific problems in that domain.
Thank you, Alison. And I take the opportunity. Who do you think is really reading and absorbing all these published papers? Yeah.
All of the reviewers, of course, are reading them very carefully. But like I mean, I do think people are reading them. Like I read a lot of papers, especially as a person who's not immersed in the field all the time now, but who uses that way of thinking. It's like I have this problem all the time where I see something in finance or in a different field that's related to a cryptographic concept. And if I have touched that specialty before, I know what to search for in the ePrint papers and can quickly get an answer to my question of, like, does differential privacy apply to this case? Like, how or how not? Or like, is this just an MPC problem in disguise? And I think for interdisciplinary research more generally, like that kind of translation is super important. And as soon as I'm slightly out of things that I really built my understanding of as a grad student or when I was immersed in it, it gets really hard for me to figure out, like, from the literature, like what is an efficient representation of this in a way that I can translate back to my problem. And so I Yeah, this is something that's very gimmicky in the startup space, but I think it's very true. It's like build a product you would use. It's like I think about this a lot because like this is a problem I have. I can't read all the papers. Like you're writing good papers. I want to read them. I can't. It's a problem I have all the time. But I think it's exacerbated by not, being a cryptographer full time. But I think honestly, it's probably a pretty widespread problem as well.
Thank you very much. We continue with Nadia now. Thank you, Nadia, for being here.
This on.
Okay, cool. So hello. So I just came from Usenix Security last week. And it was actually quite an adventure to get here on time. So my report, as somebody who has 1 foot in the security community and 1 foot in the cryptography community, is that Usenix Security had 7 tracks. This is insane. It was the same at CCS. I wasn't at Oakland this year, but basically all of the security conferences are dealing with the problem of scale. They're just a few years ahead of where the ICR is. And this, I think sort of everybody who is attending the conferences sort of agrees that at the point where you're at 7 tracks, the community aspect of the conference has disappeared. Nobody can even keep track of what papers are present at a 7-track conference. You can't like jumping in between. So there's this weird situation where there's 1,000 attendees. There's 400 people on the program committee. And at any given talk, there's maybe 30 or 40 people in the room. This, I think everybody agrees, is not what they want the community to look like. And so the security conferences are all now moving to a model where they have divorced talks from publication. And so I think Oakland is experimenting with very short talks. Usenix Security next year will be moving to having a single track of talks and then posters for everybody else and 1-minute talks. And so changes are afoot. And so these are, places where, I mean, you can perhaps use that as a natural experiment and decide if that's something that looks good for the crypto community or not, as a neighboring community. One other aspect of this that I want to mention, sort of as somebody who has like 1 foot in both places, is that cryptography papers are a problem at the security conferences. They are causing continuous issues because the cryptography authors treat the security conferences as 2nd-tier publication venues that count as top-tier publication venues for bean counters. And you all know this is true. And so what this looks like for the security conferences is they get mountains of these papers that are very well written. They're beautiful results. They sound very important. None of the reviewers want to review these papers. Nobody bids on these papers from the program committee. Nobody wants to read these papers. Nobody wants to review these papers. They get accepted because they're beautifully written and they sound very important, and then nobody goes to the talks. And so as a former program chair of Usenix Security, being on the program committee for many years, a member of the steering committee, like it has been a topic of discussion for at least like more than a decade that I have been involved in the security community. So the sort of scale issues and the scope and venue issues that the security community is dealing with, or that the cryptography community is dealing with, is actually bleeding out into our neighboring communities. So that's one thing that I want to mention, that it doesn't just affect you, what's happening here, it actually affects like other communities. I think I wanted to bring up a couple of other things. So Andreas mentioned sort of paper counting metrics, and I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on this. I think one of the contributing factors to all of this is essentially that many of us are at institutions that just count the number of top tier papers that you have. And then there's like limits, like you must have X number of top tier papers per year, per 2 years, whatever, in order to be considered like a good researcher. And so if any student who wants an academic job needs to produce, 5 to 10 top tier papers by the time they've graduated from their PhD in order to be considered for a faculty job, and every faculty member is expected to have say like 5 or more PhD students, that faculty member is producing an ungodly number of papers per year. And this is a problem. And the problem I want to like point at the root cause is these paper counting metrics. It incentivizes the kind of behavior where it's better to play the Poisson process of like write an LPU and then submit it until it gets accepted than to spend maybe years writing a more important or like deeper piece of research, because that kind of behavior does not result in you getting enough publications to be counted as a valid researcher. I don't know how to change, much like the rest of us, I don't know how to change these metrics, but I think that's one of the root causes is our institutions that say only papers from the top tier conferences count, and you need like this many per year. I mean, I want to point specifically at CS rankings as like a contributing factor to this. And one of the weird warping things in CS rankings is like we at the IACR, so like the official position is that like crypto, Eurocrypt, and AsiaCrypt are the flagship conferences at the IACR. CS rankings does not include AsiaCrypt. And I guess they're like unwilling to fix this. They also don't include NDSS from the security conferences. And so it's this weird warping thing where people from outside of the field will go look at CS rankings and see, you know, only crypto and Eurocrypt papers count, and only the number that you have count. And in fact, divide that by the number of co-authors that you have. So I mean, this is toxic. I don't know how to change it, but I want to raise that. And then actually, sort of, Allison mentioned kind of the problem of like digesting and refining and like making research understandable. I think we have a bunch of examples of that in history. For example, like Bourbaki sort of formalizing, you know, math. And that's like a really important role. I think there's been some attempt to incentivize that. So the security community has like introduced the idea of like systematization of knowledge papers that can be published as, you know, with the same kind of validity importance as like novel research papers. And I think that's like a good thing. And I think it's also great that the new journal also accepts like survey and tutorial papers. And so like if we can have that sort of pushed forward, that like, you know, it's an important role in people in the community, not just to like produce sort of incremental advances on existing research, but actually like sort of making sense and digesting like a whole body of research and doing it the right way is like an important contribution. I think that's something that may help with our scale problem.
Thank you very much. Well, this is the setup of our table. Anyone has a question here? Comment, please.
Hi, so this is I liked all your discussions up front. One thing I wanted to comment on that, Nadia, that you pointed out was about the conferences getting rid of presentations. And I think that actually links to Allison's comment. I often, if I'm trying to get into, or sometimes I'm old, so go back to some area where, hey, I did research here 15 years ago and I don't know what the state of the art is, I'll try watching presentations from 4 or 5 papers recently in that area as a starting point. And I find that really useful. Maybe other people don't. But I think getting rid of the presentations is kind of bad in that sense. I actually really like the idea of the 2-minute or 5-minute presentation that's a summary of the paper, and then the longer presentation that really explains the ideas, both existing, as a way of being able to pick that up, you know, maybe to watch the presentation so you decide whether or not the paper is worth reading, or whether or not it's really answering your question, or to give you a ramp onto the paper. So I don't know if you guys had thought about that.
Can I take that one real quick? One component of some of these proposals for decoupling publications from talks is also keeping video talks for papers to put those online. So I mean, there's still an incentive question of how much effort will you put into your video talk if it's not the main thing. But that is still a way, because I agree too. I find that presentations is how I learn best because I'm more of an auditory than a reading kind of learner. But yeah, a lot of this you can couple with having online talks, is like everybody submits a video that still is afterwards. So perhaps some of that could be preserved.
I also think that you can have then more, maybe a bit higher level and more colloquial talks. So for example, I started going to QCrypt every now and then, which is more like, it's from our quantum crypto colleagues, but it's a bit more physics inspired setup. And they have invited talks in the morning mostly, and more tutorial or overview talks by more senior people. And then have submitted talks in the afternoons, which are then really contributed and selected of already published works. But especially with this morning sessions, you get exactly these overviews. You see what's actually happening because people summarize this for you and so on. So you don't throw away this effect, you actually improve it because you don't have to dig through 5 specific papers and learn the details, but you get a nice presentation.
Ketan?
I think there's also a bigger question of, I mean, currently the conferences are mostly about presenting papers, and that's how we publish and that's how we present our results. But if we start decoupling them, then conferences can become something completely different. Like in other fields, conferences are not linked to publication, and you just invite people to talk about something that would be interesting. Like we have real world crypto, so in cryptography that works like this. And if we move to a model where everything is journals, maybe we can also transform our conferences to something more like this. And then this can also be a good way to be up to date on different topics. But I mean, it's a completely different type of conference, but I think it also can be very useful.
And so actually papers in these cases are presented by posters mostly, right? So the majority of papers that don't get accepted are just presented as posters. And in some cases, this might even be more helpful because this gets exactly discussion started really. So they also take this serious. It's not that, look, there's the corner, present your posters there and then no one is coming, but actually really everyone is going through and starting to discuss.
I spend a lot of time curating the IACR YouTube channel, which I started in part because I wanted to make sure that we could make people who couldn't travel to conference be able to listen to the talks, because sometimes the talks are a little less formal. People will say things in a talk that they won't say in a paper, so they will speculate somewhat. They will comment on how hard something was, or who did what part or something. They're a little bit different listening to an audio or video presentation. And I really wish we had, for example, videos of Shannon giving his talks, right? What could we learn from those, right? We can read his old papers, but what was he thinking about at that time? I think that would be very useful. So if you look at it from a posterity point of view, I think it's valuable for us to preserve those things. I will say it takes a bit of work to handle those things, to upload them. And I don't think we can count on YouTube being there forever. So we have to archive these things independently on our AWS storage channel. So, but I wanted to return to this thing about short talks versus long talks. So the proposal for having 1-minute talks, IACR would have to have a TikTok channel. And maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. I'm hoping somebody else would manage it. But I do think when you change the length of a talk from, say, a 50-minute invited talk where somebody really takes the effort to put in to give a cross section of the field and not just represent their own work, but sort of what is the broad spectrum of stuff going on in this area. That's very different from a 1-minute talk that said that I prove P equals NP. It's just not, you're not going to get the same kind of content out of it. And I think that people will, companies will not pay for people to travel to a conference to give a 1-minute talk. Somewhere in between there is probably a sweet spot, but I do think we have these trade-offs to evaluate. If you look at the machine learning community, they have faced this problem that the security conferences have faced really big time. So NeurIPS had something like 11,000 submissions. Right? You think of the scale of that, how many people are on the committee, and they're getting a lot of their reviews written by undergraduate students, right? So the quality of the reviews has gone down, the volume of work has gone up, but they have other problems going on in that field, which I'm glad we don't have. So that they can't reproduce a lot of the work. They can't verify a lot of the work that's claimed in the papers. I don't think crypto is starving for money, but I would like to get a sense for the community. Suppose we had like 20-minute talks, but 5 tracks, versus suppose we had 1 track, or let's say 2 tracks and 10-minute talks. So let's think about the choice between those. Would you want half the length of the paper, half the length of the talk, but then have fewer parallel tracks? Or would you have more parallel tracks and longer talks? And I don't know what the community would prefer here. How many would prefer, let's say, talks to be half as long, but have fewer tracks? Raise your hand. And how many prefer to have longer talks, but have more tracks?
How many of those hands stay up when a 5-track venue costs twice as much?
Yeah, she's really pegged a question there, right? Because we have to pay for this.
Correct that slightly. A 5-track venue costs more than twice as much. It scales like not in proportion to the.
Yeah, there are very few venues that can support that many tracks.
Yeah. And one thing that that was pointed out in Kevin's presentation is that one feature that distinguishes cryptography is that conferences are more important than journals. But if we are going to go with the model of not having presentations in the conferences, my question for the panel would be, don't you think that we, in a way, we are going to the direction of journal publications, de facto journal publications? Because where is the publication? The traditional conference publication won't exist in that model. Gaetan, do you want to?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That's actually what we're doing at FSC now. We publish as a journal and we make presentation optional. So it's supposed to be a journal publication, yes. But I think it depends on how you do it. Like currently at FSC, it's the authors choose. So it means all papers are treated equally. And I think, well, to me, I think it's important that all authors can present if they want. But another option, like they're doing in some security conferences or like they're doing at NeurIPS, is that some papers are given a slot and some papers are not given a slot. And this is something I'm not very happy about. I mean, I would prefer we don't do this, because now we're creating 2 tiers of papers. Some papers are more prestigious than others. And yeah, it's not always clear for everybody what this means. Like if you have to review, to hire someone from the machine learning community and you see 5 NeurIPS papers, and you really have to dig to understand if it's really a paper that was presented or just a poster or just something else, because there are like 10 different types of papers at NeurIPS and they all say, I have a paper at NeurIPS, but it doesn't always mean the same thing.
Anyone else who would like to?
The attempted, well, at least what Usenet Security is attempting to do to keep from having multiple tiers of papers is that they are going to choose the presentations randomly. I think this is going to backfire personally, but I'm just throwing that out there as like one option that is being considered.
I kind of well, hi. So I kind of missed if this was already mentioned, but I think I heard from a collaborator who went to Oakland recently that they're experimenting with talks and posters. So it's like they have like these little talks, but then afterward you have these posters that you talk about them still. And I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on like maybe that is a way that you don't like you can have these papers, you can have these discussions, but like, you know, you don't have to be like, oh, I missed this talk because like there was another thing at the same time and I couldn't do it, but like I can still see this poster.
Anyone
Yeah, I think one logistical challenge of that is if we just keep adding different forms, the venue constraints become really difficult. And to Nadia's point earlier, it's kind of one of these frustrating problems because our attendees are not growing at the same rate that like the paper submissions are growing. So it's not really that we need to have, 7 rooms that can all simultaneously hold 400 people because we don't have, 3,000 people at the conference, but predicting or constraining where people are going to go at what times is a separate different problem. So having venues that simultaneously have place for large poster sessions and have individual track rooms that are big enough for the most popular talk while not be feeling ridiculously empty for the least popular talk. So I think all these trade-offs are on the table and being considered, and some combination of talks and posters like makes total sense. And to your point, like they're both mechanisms that have different goals and accomplish different things. And so there's no reason not to potentially combine them. But some of these things die on the logistics rather than the ideal world kind of scenario.
I also want to raise that at some point, if you write a paper, which is 15 to 30 pages, and then you have to make a 1-minute talk, and then you have to make a 15 to 20-minute talk that's going to be uploaded to YouTube before the conference, and then you also make your poster. That's a lot of homework for like one paper. And so like, especially if you're, say, a faculty member and like the student on the paper like graduated and like went off to industry, and now you have to do like all of this homework for the paper that that they published, like that's a big burden. Or like, say, I don't know, like some, the student involved like has other things that they're doing, they're off at an internship or something, like. So I also want to sort of raise the additional work that each of these different formats of presentation is going to incur on authors specifically.
Though on the plus side, if we make it a lot of work, people will publish less papers. Exactly.
Thank you. Okay, we have one more question here.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask kind of what are the trade-offs being thought about around not to bash NeurIPS more, but one thing that happened with NeurIPS, right, is that it became like the mother of all conferences, where it's just gotten so big and it keeps growing every year. And so I'm wondering, do we as the IACR want kind of, to avoid having to sort of the one big conference or like the two big conferences, like how can we better lift up conferences that are getting like less papers, like Africa Crypt and Latin America Crypt, just as 2 examples.
Oh yeah, I can take a crack at that one. I just speaking personally, and obviously like these are issues that are complex and being actively discussed among the board and among the community. But personally, I don't want to live in that world where we have one big conference. There are some benefits of that world in terms of reducing travel, in terms of reducing environmental impact. I do think we should do things to get some of those benefits. But I think the fact that we have lots of healthy area conferences, that we have things spread out over time and space is a good thing. And we've always sort of been more decentralized as a community, I think, than the kind of, pull of one conference. And the nice thing about having multiple conferences is they could do things in different ways and they can experiment. And I think preserving some amount of that, and like to this point that was brought up earlier of like, if you have more sticky reviews and these kind of systems to reduce reviewing load by keeping more memory with the reviews, like something is also lost in terms of it's kind of nice that we have that reset. Like if you just people don't understand, or that you don't get stuck with a first impression if you didn't write your paper well the first time. So I think there's a balance point. We're probably at this point, not at the optimal point in that balance, but I personally do not want to see us move to that NeurIPS kind of world. I think there's something important to preserve. I also would love to see us find ways to promote and get, some of this sort of overflow from the main conferences into those other conferences, which could be really good for them. It would be really good for the community. I think to the point of like the paper counting metrics and the point Andreas made about the journal not sort of like counting as prestigious, it's really hard to undo some of those incentives that really push people towards the flagship conferences. But personally, I would love to see that spread out more and for those other conferences to sort of gain prestige and traction.
Thank you. We have one more question here.
I want to express a badly thought out complaint about poster sessions in particular. The ones that I've seen tend to stratify the audiences. So they work well, you know, if you've got a bunch of junior people interviewing and a bunch of senior people deciding who to hire. In that sense, they can work well. But in a community like ours, I like to think that, you know, many of the attendees here are also authors on papers. And the poster session sort of ties down the authors in one place. They don't get to see the other posters as easily, you know. And I'm against stratification of society in general. But that's just an observation.
So maybe you won't comment on this. Again, this QCrypt example, they have explicit poster sessions. They don't have this running on the side, but they have certain times where people go there, and usually there's more than one author. So you can split this, and otherwise they also split it in a few slots so that actually authors can actually go around and see the other papers. I mean, of course, there's always some loss if you're presenting yourself. This is the same if you're presenting a paper. That, I mean, while you are presenting, you cannot go to another talk. But I think you can keep this somewhat small. Right? And this is about talking about an hour or two. Like, I think this is well viable to do.
Okay, we have one more question here.
Hello. So coming back to the sort of technicalities of the review process. So at Chess, we have interesting review scale. So it rather than good and bad, you get like a major revision or you get minor revision or resubmit. So all of the like little bit bad scores are actually asking our authors to resubmit back. So I've been reviewing some papers 4 times in Chess. And one of the reasons also is that Chess papers are kind of long. So Chess is really the only venue where some of these papers can be possibly published because they are way too long for IEEE conferences, which are, for example, 12 pages max or even less. Some IEEE venues are 4 pages. So these are like 30-page monsters that can only come to Chess. So perhaps the review system could be revised in a way that if it's a resubmit, it's either a reject forever on the second time or something else, you know, accept, you know, right now. Just a suggestion.
I think so. For the CIC, we, I think, copied the policy either from FSE or from Chess, that indeed after a major revision or a reject and resubmit, you can only go to minor, like essentially shepherded or unshepherded accept, or to reject. And if you're rejected, full stop. So this is actually implemented because otherwise, indeed, you're ending in a never-ending cycle. Like, you have these authors that then just continuously resubmit.
Yeah, in FSC, I don't think we have this policy, and I think it has happened that major revision gets again major revision maybe third time. And of course, that's not great. But normally, when we ask for a revision, we try at least to have a list of conditions that the author must satisfy. The authors are of good faith, and the reviewers are not in good faith. Normally, but yes, it's a problem when we create a new system. If people are not used to this system of revision, it's very easy as a reviewer to say, well, I'm not sure about this paper. I will ask for a revision. It will give me more time to think about it. But that's really a very bad decision. So we really have to explain reviewers to not do this. And maybe just another point about paper length. You were saying papers in Chess are very long. I think it's actually the case everywhere in cryptography. I mean, when I was starting as a student for crypto, the limit was 18 pages, I think, for the final version, LNCS. Now it's 30 pages. And at the time it was 18, everybody had like 10 pages of appendix. So we thought, well, that's a problem. We should review this appendix and put them in the paper. So now the limit is 30, and there are 20 pages of appendix. that are not
That's
reviewed on the
exactly
paper.
it. So the thing is that many chess papers could be potentially published at IEEE or ACM venues, but they are too long for it. So it's just that they are stuck with ISAR things, which have this sort of coming from a little bit different background than other papers. So that's why we get resubmissions. Otherwise, they would probably go for a minor IEEE conference.
Just one quick comment on the length of papers. I think that is a place where if we think about the sort of data structure problem of a paper as a unit, it's like sometimes some of those pages, like in theory papers, are just rehashing the same background, the same definitions, the same overview. And so it's nice to have a self-contained paper, but I feel like it would be better if we had one central place where you just like have a link to like, this is the IBE definition, and then we can save a lot of space in individual papers that way.
Needs a widely agreed definition. And I can tell you there are areas.
Who's an author would choose to reference that. Yeah.
Okay, some more questions? Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
So, hello. So, sorry to come back to the question that was asked before, but like, I really struggle to understand. You now have this sick journal, which the goal was to help alleviate the pressure on the conferences, and climate change was a reason to have the journal so people don't have to travel so far. But yet, for the first point, you don't foster the smaller conferences that are associated with the AICR. So you chose this journal instead of helping Latin Crypt, Africa Crypt, Indo Crypt. You chose to do that instead. You still do crypto here, which is extremely far. So communities in the global south really, really struggle to come here. You know, the visa process is crazy. Access to tickets to come to the States is quite limited. Still, people of color like me have little representation just in this panel. Like nobody that looks like me is sitting there. So no, you are moderating. So the decision makers like really ignore this kind of positions, and the answers that we are getting are like this. So like I really struggle to understand what's the thought process to still justifying not helping Latin Crypt, not helping Indo Crypt, not helping Africa Crypt, but having a journal that, as you said, now needs to have like a high standard for submissions and like have a high rating because that's what we want, and keep crypto in Santa Barbara. I really struggle to understand how these two things actually link.
May I, so maybe I can comment a bit on this. So, I mean, the journal was a community decision in the end. This was brought up by people, but in the end, the ICR members voted for this, right? So this took in everyone that is at conferences. I think it's not helping the smaller conferences. I mean, I ended up as editor on this because I was representing one small conference, namely SAC, in the discussion panel around the journal. And one of the tasks for us was also to look into how to actually support the small conferences. And we reached out to all of them with different options of how we could potentially collaborate or in how far the journal could be a chance for the conferences. And this was not taken up. I think from Latin Crypt, we actually got a response, but there the problem is that in many areas of Latin America, you need to publish your master thesis in a ranked publication. And the journal is, of course, not ranked yet. And that was the reason why I think even Francesco told us, hey, at this point, we cannot consider this.
Without the journal, to dedicate that funding, try to help the conference because it's not a problem of the rankings that they have right now. It's a problem of the AICR not opening the doors to try to give enough funding, the publicity, the name, the backing. That's why the conference, like in Latin Crypt, Indo Crypt, and Africa Crypt struggle, because EICR is not behind them, and instead they decided to invest on this journal. Like, to be frank with you, I really struggle to understand why people keep claiming that the role of this journal is to help ease the pressure on the other venues, when you have this clear alternative to help the communities that also are part of the cryptographic world, and you choose instead this. Like, I really struggle.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Yes.
I think it would be accurate to say there is no funding for the journal. I mean, I think the total cost spent on the journal is something like $1,000. And so you don't fund a conference for that. And the other thing is that I think the IACR runs as a volunteer organization, and there are not a lot of resources involved. If you add more conferences to the IACR's list of things to do, they're going to be done badly. And I think the IACR is already strained that way. I'm not a member of the board, but I observe a lot of the activities going on, and it's really strained covering all of the things. Now, you might I think you can make a proposal to the board to adopt a new conference as an official IACR conference and run it through the process. I mean, that was essentially what was done with the other conferences, to, you know, make a proposal to the board, and they were adopted. But I don't think it's really a money issue. I think it's more of a constraint on people's time. And I wanted to put Nadia on the spot before we disappear to ask you, which of the innovations for the security conferences do you think will be most successful to address their scalability?
I think that it is necessary for everybody's sanity to divorce publication from presentation. Like, I know this is a controversial viewpoint, but I think it's sort of, it actually is necessary given the volume that everybody is seeing in publications. If I were empress of the security community and, I don't know, the crypto community, I think the thing that seems to be most successful perhaps is if we look at the success of RWC, which is not a publication venue, it is only a talk venue, but the talks are chosen based on what the program committee thinks will be interesting to the audience. And I think that has been very successful, evidently, as a community venue for people to go to. People actually go to the talks at RWC, unlike many other conferences. So I think some combination of having a program that is sized at a human scale where you can do that, and then choosing talks based off of what would be interesting to the attendees, plus perhaps giving younger authors some exposure, perhaps in a second track like that I think, and then perhaps with like an invited track as well. That might be like a 3-track conference, and that would be reasonable enough for everybody to find something that they want to attend. People might attend talks again, but it wouldn't be just like a sort of overwhelming logistical mess. So I think that's picking one innovation and then sort of dropping the rest. My personal opinion. We're
Okay.
supposed to be controversial here, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, one great thing about having great panelists is that you really don't need to do much as a moderator. They moderate by themselves. And it has been, we could stay talking about this for much more time. Unfortunately, it's already time to go. I want, please, thanks the speakers first. And I'm sure that you can discuss with them if you want to have some more questions or comments about what we discussed today. And before you go, we have an announcement by our program chair.
Hi, thanks everyone for attending this first day. So we have a cocktail reception just outside for 2 hours until 7. If you're staying in the dorm and you want to have dinner, where we had lunch is open until 7:30. So don't forget to go before it closes. Yeah, congratulations for all this first day and to all the speakers. Enjoy.